Ludwig von Beethoven began his public career as a composer with the publication of his 3 Opus 1 piano trios in 1795, works heavily indebted to Joseph Haydn and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. By the time he published the 2 trios that comprise his Opus 70, he had well and truly found his own voice, the voice that we also hear in the C minor and pastoral symphonies, the 4th piano concerto, and the A major cello sonata, Opus 69. The Opus 70 works were composed in 1808 and first played on Christmas Day of that year with the composer at the piano. The first of the set, the D major composition under examination here, has acquired a nickname, the Ghost, mostly on account of the slow movement's spectral quality. Except for the honorary piano trio, Opus 11, actually intended for clarinet, cello, and piano, this is the only one of Beethoven's piano trios that's organized in 3 movements, not 4. And this is a far more serious work than that other one I named in passing. Before taking up the movements for individual consideration, I want to say a few words about my relationship to the music that I cover on this channel and how that relationship is reflected in the videos I make. Before taking my first deep dive into this music about 5 years ago, when my video making skills were considerably more primitive than they are even now, I had heard several performances of this trio and had listened to recordings of it from time to time. These encounters were always enjoyable, and with repeated listenings over the years, I had accrued a casual music lover's acquaintance with the trio, but not yet anything that could be called a deep understanding of it. What I present in this video, and others like it, is a representation of the findings that I made once I started examining the music seriously, the kinds of findings that do lead to a deep understanding. Every time I go through that process of careful examination, I'm impressed by how much deeper my appreciation has grown in the process, and how much I've come to love the music under review for the effort of learning it. I want to illustrate this with a brief account of my discovery of Movement 2. It's a long movement, 10¼ minutes in this recording, and it moves at an agonizingly slow pace. You'll have to keep track of its duple time divisions with 4 very broad beats per measure. The organic quality of this music is so thoroughgoing that it's not easy to keep it all straight, and it took me several trips through it with the score in front of me even to discern its formal layout, which is absolutely essential to the understanding of any music. It turns out that it's the sonata plan that's being used here, but there are some features of the music that are unorthodox as far as sonata form goes. One is that the themes are worked out to extravagant length, and one runs into trouble when trying to parse them. Is there a formal transition or not? I've identified one in my analysis, but I acknowledge that it's not what we'd usually expect, and structurally speaking, it could as well be thought the logical extension of theme 1 as not, especially since it doesn't modulate. Another is the choice of key for the second theme, which begins at the movement's tonic but quickly gravitates to the subtonic, C major, rather than the minor dominant or the movement's mediant key, as is the usual case with minor key essays. And finally, the development section is very short in proportion to the movement's overall length, surely owing, at least in part, to the fact that a great deal of thematic development has already taken place during the unfolding of the themes themselves. I couldn't have told you any of these things before making my deep dive, and now that I know them, my appreciation for this music has grown immeasurably. And this is the gift that I'm trying in turn to bring to you. In this recording, we'll hear violinist Itzhak Perlman, cellist Lynn Harrell, and pianist Vladimir Ashkenazy. In Movement 1, we encounter the rhetorical Beethoven, who has supplied this D major essay with themes that absolutely beg for development. Themes comprised of short, pregnant motives that can be teased apart, pitted against each other, and worked out in new and often surprising configurations. One of the most notable features of this trio is its robust overall sound, which is almost orchestral at times. The movement opens with an aggressive D major flourish in 4 parallel octaves, whose modality is called into question in measure 4. On close examination, it becomes apparent that that opening flourish is little more than a rapidly descending D major scale, made entertaining by several octave displacements and a couple of skips by displaced thirds introduced into the line. By following that Hackley opening with a singable tune in broad lyrical strokes, Beethoven has placed 2 aspects of his musical personality on open display during the first theme alone, and will spend the rest of the movement demonstrating what a rich array of musical idea can spring from such a personality. The second theme is a wonderful thing, a gentle, breathless, melodic entreaty plied against a great wave-like ostinato, heard twice with a reassignment of parts the second time, and following a brief celebration, the exposition closes tenderly in A major. Since the exposition is repeated, you'll have a second chance to get the thematic and harmonic relationships secured in your musical memory, the better to enjoy the recapitulation and the changes that occur there. The development is occupied almost entirely by a consideration of the first theme's motives, with the treatment reaching a peak of astonishing polyphonic intensity before subsiding and making way for the return, which includes some noteworthy surprises. During the 19th century, it became almost a musical doctrine that the recapitulation would be reduced in some way, usually by truncating the first theme in some manner or another. Here, Beethoven has done the opposite, doubling the length of his presentation of the first theme, letting it drift into flat submediant territory for a spell, and including a ruminative passage that reflects on the theme's meaning. There's enlargement also in the transition, whose final paragraph is doubled in length by an unexpected journey into G major, where the second theme begins, and from which it emerges anon into the full glow of the movement's tonic key, also trailing an additional phrase. Beethoven has also called for a repeat of the second large section of the movement, the development plus recap, but that's almost never observed in performance, and it is ignored in this recording, so we'll be skipping over a first ending right before a brief coda that begins meditatively in the subdominant key, soon picks up steam, and ties everything together, ending with a D major shout. The heart and soul of this composition is its slow movement, deep, inner-directed D minor music that unfolds at a pace very much out of step with the breakneck onrush of the modern world. This is music that could not have been written by a younger Beethoven, music by a mature, sober man given to deep reflection who by that time in his life knew a full measure of sorrow and regret. Full enjoyment of this music very much depends on the listener's state of mind, and I'd recommend you achieve a completely receptive state by whatever means necessary before beginning. This is not music that can be listened to or even tolerated by anyone who's in a hurry or apt otherwise to become distracted, nor could it have been written by anyone who matches that description. I've already said a few things about this movement and don't want to repeat myself, so I'll summarize. The music is constructed along sonata lines with its solemn first theme spun out to prodigious length and the largely C major second theme growing organically out of the D minor first. The brief development section rises to an almost unbearable pitch of torment, and once its outrage is spent, yields without protest to the recap, where the first theme is now graced with a counter melody first supplied by the piano right hand, rich in slow melodic arabesques. I know that among my viewers are some with finely honed analytical skills, and some of you may question certain calls I've made during both the exposition and recapitulation, namely the identification of a formal transition and second theme as requisite diagnostic features of sonata form, since the unfolding of the movement is so organic and seamless. I hope it's understood by everyone that what you see in these videos very often represents my second or third thought about almost any set of features in them. In the process of focusing on increasingly granular details, I'm more often than not confronted with the necessity of rethinking and revising my conclusions. So you can be sure that for any decision I make that might be regarded as controversial, I've considered every alternative I can think of before committing myself to a final say. So although what follows may seem opaque at best and arid at worst to those of my viewers who'd rather I get on with the music, permit me to make my case. This will be a digression of some length, so if you'd rather skip ahead, I'll include the target timing in my comments beneath this video. The diagnostic features of sonata form are these: the presentation of two themes of at least somewhat contrasting character in two related keys during an exposition, a development section that subjects those themes to some measure of harmonically active examination, and a recapitulation during which the two themes are both brought back in the tonic key and thus reconciled. So, confronted with that short list of requirements, it must mean that two themes of at least somewhat contrasting character are present here, and the usual means of getting from one to the other is through a transitional passage that modulates or not as needed. In the present case, the exposition begins in D minor and ends in a somewhat unusual secondary key, C major. The choice of this secondary key is what we expect of music in the Dorian mode, by the way. See Sibelius's Sixth Symphony for a telling example. The key of C major is not fully attained until well into the exposition, and the absolutely gorgeous climax of that exposition is in that key. The proportions, key-wise, are unusual to say the least. The industry standard of the era of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven was that, during the exposition, one spends a lot more time in the secondary key than in the primary one. Here, we're confronted with the opposite. Another problem lies in a trap that's easy to fall into, as I know from experience. That is, the first theme appears at first blush to be in ABA form, which would not be at all unusual. This is exactly the conclusion your ear will lead you to if you listen to the first 20 or so measures without preconceptions. First, you'll hear an 8-measure passage that examines a solemn compound melodic figure from 4 different harmonic perspectives and ends with full closure on the tonic. This could well be the A portion of a theme in ternary form, as the 9-measure passage that follows, standing in high relief against what preceded it and what will follow it, clearly functions as B. In measure 18, A then returns, seemingly bent on completing the ABA pattern. The music has not, to this point, modulated. But it is this return that finds its way into the glow of C major, and I thus identify it as theme 2, a second theme of unusual character derived from the first theme and the 4 dominant prolonging measures preceding it as a non-modulating transition. Obviously, I've not yet made my case, but I'm about to. Consider what happens during the recapitulation. Theme 1 tracks precisely with its exposition statement, albeit with the expected counter-melodic enhancements. But this time, during that dominant prolongation that leads to what first struck the ear as a return to the A portion of the theme, the mode is shifted at the last moment, and the prolongation ends in D major. The return of what follows then begins in the parallel key, which is very much what we would expect of a second theme on its return during a sonata-form movement. That means that this time the transition did, in a sense, modulate, at least by shifting mode and preparing the way for a D major return. Now it's easier to hear that returning passage as the second theme during the recapitulation, and the whole movement makes sense in a way that no other understanding of it does. I hope that digression was useful. I'd be interested in hearing what you think about this puzzle and my solution to it. Needless to say, that major key beatitude that begins the return of theme 2 is only momentary, and when the mode shifts back to the minor, there's no further possibility of consolation. The coda is almost unspeakably sad, especially the way that one brief ray of D major sunshine right before the end raises hopes that are smashed forthwith by a minor subdominant fist. And the music soon afterwards dies away in utter desolation. In all the music I know from Beethoven's pen, I can think of no movement more devastating than this one, although the C minor funeral march from the Eroica Symphony comes close. I find myself shaken every time I listen to it. That means, of course, that I love it very deeply. The finale, of course, is the modal corrective to that somber D minor music we just heard. The movement is a closely reasoned sonata-form essay whose intended exposition repeat is ignored in this recording. I have to say a few words about that. I always feel disappointed, even cheated, when composers' clearly expressed intentions are overruled by performers. This is no mere quibble. At the very least, the omitting of a large region of music, albeit a repeated region, has a distorting effect on the shape of the whole, and in this case, the damage goes far deeper than that. The 8 measures of music that lead up to the first ending that will be skipped over mean 2 different things, depending on whether you're hearing the exposition the first time through or the second. The function of that passage literally changes and can be appreciated only in retrospect. The first time through, that 8-bar passage is a bridge to the exposition repeat whose opening phrase lies under the first ending sign. The second time through the exposition, however, the downbeat of that 8-measure passage is also the downbeat of the development section, which begins before the double bar. You should be able to hear this easily enough if you'll reorient and restart the clock right at that moment. You'll experience an apparent 32-bar paragraph unfolding by sequence as you take the ride. The first theme is an engaging composite of contrasting ideas, with its opening boldly asserting D major but calling it into question almost immediately. The remainder of the theme satisfactorily addresses that question and seems to celebrate the emergence of Beethoven's D major piano trio from the umbra of parallel key gloom that dominated its second movement. The mood throughout the movement seems celebratory. From beginning to end, the music just sparkles. One of the most ear-catching of this movement's many arresting features is a digression into the flat submediate area during the second group, a sidestep foreshadowed during the transition. That's F major during the exposition and B flat major during the recap. These are certainly striking key relations. Other than that, I want only to mention that the coda brings the return of the main theme in a way that lends an overall rondo-like shape to the movement, with the first attempt at presentation driven off into the chromatic weeds by brittle pizzicati, and its second statement divided seamlessly between the 2 sostenuto strings. And of course, the movement finishes with a shout of triumph. What other kind of ending would even be possible?